Next speaker is Professor Francis Richmond from University of Southern California, presenting on crossing the valley of death, moving products towards commercialization and clinical practice.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you, and it is always nice to go at the end because many things have been said that saved me a little time. My topic is a little bit different, perhaps, but I think it shares my ideas that I'm going to present here probably resonate with you guys, which is that we all share, this is the mission statement of CLINAM. We've got a bit of a reverb here. This is the mission statement of CLINAM for the clinicians and researchers that are the drivers toward innovation for the benefit of the patient. And I want to look at that word innovation because I think we're all concerned about getting all the good science we see here into patients at some point in future, hopefully in nearer future. That word innovation is a funny one. It's used very loosely. But if you look at the definition that many people have developed more recently, Stossel defines it as discoveries, inventions, or devices that benefit patients. An idea put into practice which proves to be useful and valuable in effecting change. The work, capital, and pursuit that pushes an innovation to a realized useful product. And I think the word innovation in this context is differentiated from the discovery we see on many posters outside, but also the invention. I mean, you can take a product into some kind of a device or some kind of a drug form, but as we heard earlier, that's not the end of it. There's a lot of work to be done to get that into patients. I mean, this has been captured in any number of slides you've seen before. This is one from about nano manufacturing, for example, and fits nicely with an earlier talk. And essentially what it says is what we all know, and that is there's a lot of funding and investment in these early stages from government. So we develop dendrimers, and we develop micelles, and we develop lots of good things. The private sector is expected to pick that up. I mean, government funding isn't going to be found out here, right? And in between is this gap that has variously been called the Valley of Death or the Great Divide. And I wanted to talk just for a minute about why we have such a gap and what we can do to help it and whether we can help it, because I think we have to be realistic in this regard. There's a model by Sullivan and Beach, which I ended up looking at retrospectively after I chose two areas that I thought were very important and found out they were the pillars of their model on risk management success. But I think it also is here. So there are two real gaps I see. One of, obviously, everybody says is the resource gap, right? If we only had more money, we'd be set. So the resource gap is a gap of money. I mean, there's never enough money. But I think there's also a resource gap that many of our laboratories lack the ability, the knowledge, and the capability to do quality oversight. Making sure that you put quality systems in place at an earlier stage is really difficult and expensive. And typically that's the first thing to go when you are looking at getting your grant renewed. Also, equipment calibration. It sounds like a small thing, but you'd be surprised how many times the research goes astray or takes a lot longer, is a lot more expensive, simply because of the equipment is not properly calibrated in a lab. Now, what would be the effect of more money? So forgive me my cartooning thing, but if we had more funding, we'd probably have better, more inventions. And those inventions would be marginally closer to industry, although I suspect if we had more money, it wouldn't go to some of the things industry would see as important. I think we expect that if we have more money, industry would come to us. And I think that to some extent that's true. Industry needs you. It needs new ideas. It's not investing in basic science, and it's going to buy that. And there are probably people at this meeting who are looking, pretty with a steely stare at some of those posters, trying to figure out what they can commercialize out there. But what else is missing is a competency gap, and I'm going to writ this large. I'm not going to talk about this just in terms of, educating 10 students. I'm going to talk about the bigger picture. What do we need? Well, very few labs have a very capable knowledge of regulatory strategy or policy. Some labs, but not all labs, really understand intellectual property. They know how to put in a provisional patents, but after that it sort of breaks down. And the kinds of things that are being developed here, if they get taken up and become commercially successful, there's going to be so many lawsuits over the IP. And so that IP needs to be very, very well done. And typically universities aren't all that great at doing wonderful patents. They can do patents, but not patents that necessarily hold up well when they're litigated. Marketing positioning. Oftentimes you'll ask somebody, well, what are you going to use this for? And they say, well, I don't know, cancer. Okay, what cancer? How are you going to, what's your market? What are the other people in the market doing? Who are your competitors in this environment? Legal limitations. I mean, what can you do with this stuff? Formulation and packaging. So I was delighted at the talk earlier because people often forget that this stuff is really hard to make. It's hard to manage. It's hard to package. It's hard to store. It's hard to ship. There's lots of things to be still figured out. But I think that if we knew more about what industry needs, we might be more sympathetic to industry and be able to move a little bit closer to meet them halfway by understanding their needs. And a little bit later, I'm going to talk about that today. And hopefully by doing that, then more investment would come more from the private sector. I was interested in this article by Blevins et al. It was very general. It wasn't directed at this group necessarily, but it said how good ideas die. And he said there are 5 things he thinks, and some of them are pretty good ideas. First is the lack of a deliberate process. Going into science and saying, this is fun, we're learning lots of nice things, and I have no problem with that. I've been a scientist. But if you're going to get a product commercialized, you have to have a slightly different view, and you have to look at it in strategic terms. Second is assuming that an invention is an innovation, because there's a lot of work to do after the invention stage. Third is having an incomplete or flawed team. Now, very frequently in the US at least, the only way to get this to move forward is to make a small business yourself. And scientists are not that good at small businesses, but you still need to make them if you're going to get small business innovation grants, which are only accessible if you have a small business. And their funding rates are much higher than the funding rates for basic science. So we see a lot of people printing business cards now and developing cool names for their companies. But then, the teams are not quite all there because they don't understand the process yet. It's going to be an education. Of course, inadequate resources. I don't think people truly, when they see the numbers of Pfizer and AstraZeneca and the others, in the billions of dollars. And you can question those numbers, but even let's say the multiple millions of dollars, taking that drug into production, and you say, is that because they're just really bad? I could do it for $1 million? No, it's going to cost you that much, and so you're not going to be able to complete the process typically by yourself. At some point, you have to work with a big company, a company that has that kind of resource base in order for that product to be moved forward. And that's kind of the only game in town right now. So the trick is to make sure, and finally, the lack of cultural support. Universities are not the greatest at supporting innovation. Their mission is different and their motives are different. So it can be hard in a department which has people who are mostly at the discovery stage to have them understand and support you. One is There's a little bit of jealousy if you're getting to the point where you're getting closer to commercialization. There's a little bit of that. But there's also just not understanding why you're doing that. It's like you're leaving the monastery and you're starting to go outside. So all of these things are challenges. But I think that if we don't understand what's important to industry and why it's important to industry, on the regulatory side, on the manufacturing side, on the quality side, on the intellectual property side, on the market position side, and if we don't understand where industry is coming from, we will misread their motives, and we will make it much more difficult to work with them, when in fact we kind of have to. And we don't want our academic champions, just without understanding these things, to delay or destroy collaboration. So, what do we do for a living? Where I come from, we really do a lot of training. We have undergraduate programs that start to introduce students. We have a lot of master's programs here, that specialize in these kinds of areas to increase their knowledge, either from, baby undergraduates to people who come to us from industry to get trained. And so we can do these things, but we have to ask whether that's enough to close this gap. So that's really my message, and I think I'm right on zero. So thank you very much.
Thank you.